Picture this. The Roman Empire has fallen in the West. Rome itself is a hollowed ruin, its people scattered, its monuments crumbling. Yet in the East, in Constantinople, a flame still burns, and in that flickering light, one man will emerge. A soldier who fought Persians, Vandals, Goths, and Slavs, a commander who restored lost provinces, saved an empire from rioters, and nearly became emperor himself. His name was Belisarius, the man many call the last great Roman general. But was he truly the last? Was he Rome's final spark of military brilliance before the long medieval twilight? Or was he, instead, a tragic figure, loyal to a suspicious emperor, victorious in war but defeated by politics? Today we step back into the 6th century, into an age of plague, riots, endless wars, and dreams of restoration. This is not simply a story of battles, but of loyalty, ambition, betrayal, and the strange fate of an empire that could not decide whether it was still Rome or something new. So settle in as we journey through 50 chapters, across deserts, seas, ruined cities, and palace intrigues. The story of Belisarius is not just the story of a man, it is the story of the last attempt to rebuild Rome itself. The Roman Empire after the fall, East versus West, when Rome fell in for 76 AD. The Western Empire fractured into barbarian kingdoms, Goths in Italy, Vandals in North Africa, Franks in Gaul, and Visigoths in Spain. Yet in Constantinople, the emperors of the East still called themselves Romans. Their empire was Greek in language, Christian in religion, and increasingly Byzantine in culture, but in their minds, there was no Byzantine Empire. They were still Romans. And their capital was the New Rome. The Eastern Empire was wealthier and more defensible than the West. Its borders were ringed by massive walls, and its treasury was fattened by control of Mediterranean trade routes. Yet it faced endless threats: Persia to the east, barbarian raiders on the Danube, and hostile powers in North Africa and Italy. To rule was to constantly put out fires. The empire survived not because it was invincible, but because it could bend without breaking, endure disasters, and rebuild. In this precarious world, Roman identity itself was on the line. Was the empire merely Greek with Roman costumes, or was it truly a continuation of the Caesars? This question mattered, because when Justinian came to power, he would not accept survival alone. He wanted to reclaim the western provinces, to stitch the empire back together. His dream required armies, generals, and daring campaigns that could rival Caesar or Trajan. And in that moment, fate brought forth Belisarius. The Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century was an age of transition. Constantinople was a glittering metropolis, its Hagia Sophia under construction, its markets full of silks and spices, its palace humming with intrigue. But outside the capital, provinces groaned under heavy taxation, wars, and the looming specter of plague. It was an empire of wealth and misery, where gold could buy armies. Yet peasants were often crushed by the demands of emperors who dreamed of glory. The army itself was no longer the legions of old Rome. Gone were the rectangular shields and short swords of Caesar's men. In their place stood a mixed force, armored cavalry known as cataphracts, archers on horseback inspired by steppe nomads, infantry with spears and shields, and mercenaries from across the known world. It was a cosmopolitan army, flexible but costly, fragile if not led with brilliance. The church also loomed large. Christianity was not just a faith but the state ideology. Emperors were crowned with God's blessing, and heresy could be as dangerous as treason. This meant generals were not only warriors, but also guardians of orthodoxy. Any failure in war could be interpreted as divine disfavor. Thus, a commander's burden was not just tactical but spiritual. Victory meant God was on your side, while defeat could be career-ending. It was in this crucible of politics, religion, and ambition that Belisarius began his rise. A man who would embody both the strengths and weaknesses of Justinian's Rome, Justinian's vision. Restoring the Roman world, Justinian came to power in 527 AD with a burning ambition. It's not merely to rule the Eastern Empire, but to restore the glory of Rome itself. Unlike emperors before him, he dreamed of reconquering lost lands, North Africa, Italy, and even parts of Spain. His goal was nothing less than to rebuild the empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. But vision alone was not enough. Justinian was shrewd, calculating, and ruthless. He raised taxes mercilessly to fund wars and construction. He surrounded himself with skilled advisors, such as the brilliant general Belisarius and the cunning eunuch Narses. Most famously, he had Theodora as his empress, a former actress turned formidable partner whose iron will often outmatched his own. To achieve his vision, Justinian needed victories, and victories required leaders who could deliver results against impossible odds. This is where Belisarius entered the story. A man who could fight Persians in the east, crush riots at home, and lead fleets across seas to conquer forgotten provinces. Justinian saw in him a tool, perhaps even a savior. But emperors rarely trust their saviors for long, the military machine of Byzantium. By the 6th century, warfare had evolved. The Byzantine army was no longer the blunt instrument of Rome's legions, but a finely tuned machine of combined arms. Cavalry dominated, especially the heavily armored horsemen who carried lances and bows. Infantry were still vital, but their role was increasingly defensive, holding lines, guarding fortifications, and anchoring cavalry maneuvers. What set the Byzantine military apart was its adaptability. They borrowed from everyone Persian cavalry tactics, steppe nomad archery, Roman engineering, and Greek naval traditions. They could field siege engines one day, launch cavalry raids the next, and deploy fleets across the Mediterranean. This flexibility allowed them to survive against diverse enemies, from Persian kings to Gothic warlords. But this army was expensive, fragile, and dependent on competent leadership. Without strong generals, campaigns collapsed. Without careful logistics, men starved. And without loyalty, victories turned into betrayals. It was a system that could shine brilliantly under commanders like Belisarius, and falter disastrously under lesser men. The rise of Belisarius, from obscurity to command Belisarius, was born around 500 AD, likely in Thrace, the rugged Balkan frontier where Rome's military traditions still thrived. He was not from noble stock. His family was modest, perhaps minor landowners. But like many ambitious young men, he found a path through the army. His early service impressed, and soon he caught the eye of Justinian, then a rising figure in the imperial court. What made Belisarius stand out was not only his skill, but his versatility. He was as comfortable in cavalry maneuvers as in infantry tactics, equally skilled in siege warfare and open battle. More importantly, he showed restraint and discipline, a rare quality in an age when generals often sought personal glory. Justinian recognized in him a man who could be both brilliant and loyal. By his early 30s, Belisarius had already been entrusted with commanding forces against Persia. This was an extraordinary rise for someone of his background. He was not a senator, not from the old aristocracy. He was a soldier, elevated by talent alone. And soon, he would prove his worth in the deserts of the East, where Rome and Persia clashed for supremacy. The eternal enemy, Rome and Persia. For centuries, Rome and Persia had been locked in a duel that stretched across deserts, mountains, and generations. Unlike the barbarians of the West, Persia was no ragged kingdom. It was a civilization equal in power, wealth, and ambition to Rome itself. The Sassanid Empire ruled from Ctesiphon on the Tigris. It was a state of immense resources, boasting disciplined armies, armored cavalry known as Clibanarii, and a religious ideology centered on Zoroastrianism that gave their kings divine legitimacy. For the Romans, Persia was not just another enemy, it was the rival. The Shadow Empire, the eternal mirror in which Rome saw itself. By the 6th century, the rivalry had entered a new phase. Neither empire could destroy the other outright, so they fought a grinding series of wars over border fortresses in Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Syria. These wars were costly, endless, and often inconclusive. One side would seize a fortress only to lose it a few years later. Yet the stakes were immense: control of trade routes, influence over buffer states, and above all, prestige. If Rome appeared weak, its subjects and enemies would sense blood in the water. If Persia faltered, its nobles and priests would whisper doubts about their king's mandate from the gods. Into this contest came Belisarius, a relatively young general entrusted with defending the eastern frontier. He faced not raiders or rebels, but a disciplined foe with centuries of experience in war. Here, in the deserts and fortresses of Mesopotamia, he would begin to shape his reputation, proving himself not only a tactician, but a master of adaptability against one of Rome's oldest and deadliest enemies. Belisarius at Dara, a masterpiece of strategy. In 530 AD, Belisarius confronted the Persians at Dara, near the frontier with Mesopotamia. It was one of the most decisive moments of his early career. The Persians, confident in their numbers and cavalry, marched to crush the Romans. Belisarius, outnumbered and commanding largely untested troops, had to find a way to survive. What he achieved would become a textbook case of military genius. Belisarius transformed the battlefield into a weapon. He ordered deep trenches dug across the Roman front, forcing Persian cavalry into narrow channels where their mobility was useless. He positioned his cavalry on the wings, hiding reserves behind hills. When the Persians charged, expecting to overwhelm the Romans with brute force, they were funneled into these killing grounds. The trenches broke their momentum, and the Roman cavalry swept in from the sides, striking at exposed flanks. The battle was fierce, lasting 2 days. At one point the Persians broke through, only to be driven back by desperate counterattacks, but Belisarius held firm. When the dust settled, the Persians were forced to withdraw, suffering heavy losses. For the first time in years, the Romans had won a clear, decisive victory against their ancient enemy. Word of Dara spread quickly, and Belisarius's name became known not only in Constantinople, but also in Ctesiphon, where Persian nobles now whispered his name with unease. The siege of Nisibis and the Persian Wars. Fresh from his triumph, Belisarius was ordered to press deeper into Persian territory. The target was Nisibis, a fortress city that had long been a thorn in Rome's side. Strategically located, Nisibis controlled routes into Mesopotamia and symbolized Persian dominance in the region. Capturing it would have been a crowning achievement, but Belisarius soon discovered that not all victories were possible. The siege revealed the limits of Roman power. Nisibis was heavily fortified, supplied and defended by determined troops. The Persians had mastered the art of siege defense, and Belisarius lacked the heavy equipment and manpower needed to break through. Weeks dragged on, and the Romans suffered under Persian raids, desert heat, and dwindling supplies. Eventually, Belisarius had to withdraw, leaving the fortress unconquered. But the siege was not a disaster. Belisarius showed remarkable restraint in avoiding a pointless slaughter, preserving his army for future campaigns. This decision, though frustrating to Justinian, reflected his pragmatism. He understood that sometimes survival was more valuable than glory. These lessons, knowing when to strike and when to retreat, would shape his future campaigns, distinguishing him from reckless generals who won battles but lost wars. Lessons learned, early defeats and reforms. Not every engagement on the Eastern Front went in Belisarius' favor. After Dara, the Persians regrouped, striking back with cunning and ferocity. At Callinicum in 531, Belisarius faced one of his most difficult tests. The battle was fought along the Euphrates, and though accounts differ, the Romans were ultimately forced to retreat. For his enemies, it was proof that Dara had been a fluke. For Belisarius, it was a harsh lesson in the dangers of overextension. But what marked him apart was his ability to adapt. Instead of crumbling under defeat, Belisarius studied what went wrong, the weakness of his allies. The unpredictability of desert warfare, the overconfidence of some of his officers. He reorganized his troops, improved discipline, and refined tactics to make his army more resilient. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for his later victories, ensuring that he would not repeat the same mistakes. In Constantinople, the defeat at Callinicum might have ruined another general's career. But Justinian, who valued results above all, kept faith in Belisarius. Perhaps he saw in the young commander not perfection, but potential, the rare quality of learning and improving under pressure. That faith would soon pay off, not only in foreign wars, but in the most dangerous threat Justinian's throne would ever face his own people, diplomacy in war, Persia at the gates. The wars with Persia were never just about battlefields. They were also about diplomacy, bribery, and calculated truces. Belisarius soon discovered that Justinian's ambitions stretched further than simple victory. The emperor needed peace in the east to focus on his western conquests. This meant negotiating with the Persians even after blood had been spilled. The Persians, too, recognized the limits of war. Victories were costly, and neither empire could afford endless campaigns without risking collapse. After years of back-and-forth fighting, both sides agreed to what became known as the Eternal Peace in 532. Though eternal was wishful thinking, it bought Justinian the breathing room he needed to launch his great project of reconquest in the West. For Belisarius, these years on the eastern frontier had been transformative. He had tasted victory and defeat, faced the might of Persia, and proven himself as a commander capable of both brilliance and humility. Now, with peace secured, Justinian was ready to turn him toward a new challenge, not against Persia, but against the chaos brewing in the heart of Constantinople itself. Constantinople in flames. The Nika Revolt. Constantinople in the 6th century was the beating heart of the Roman world. A city of gold-topped churches, bustling markets, and imperial pomp. But beneath the surface, the capital was also a cauldron of discontent. High taxes, corruption, and the emperor's iron-fisted rule bred resentment among both the aristocracy and the common people. At the center of this unrest were the factions of the Hippodrome, the Blues, and the Greens, groups that began as chariot-racing teams but had evolved into political movements with real influence in the streets. In January 532, their anger exploded. A botched execution of faction leaders sparked riots that spiraled out of control. What began as a sporting rivalry turned into a full-scale insurrection, with mobs pouring into the streets, chanting the infamous cry, "Nika conquer." The city that was the jewel of the empire soon became a nightmare of smoke and blood. Palaces were attacked, shops looted, and fires raged across entire districts. The scale of destruction was staggering. Ancient monuments were torn down, homes were reduced to ashes, and the great church of Hagia Sophia, the pride of the Christian Empire, was burned to the ground. Justinian himself was on the verge of fleeing the city, his legitimacy crumbling as senators whispered support for a new ruler. For a brief, terrifying moment, the Roman Empire's survival hung in the balance. Belisarius crushes the rioters as Constantinople burned. Justinian turned to his generals. Among them was Belisarius, fresh from campaigns against Persia and Mundus, an experienced commander of Gothic origin. Together, they were tasked with ending the revolt before the empire itself was lost. But this was no battlefield in Mesopotamia or Africa. This was urban warfare in the heart of the capital, where every street was a potential death trap and every citizen a possible enemy. Belisarius acted with ruthless efficiency. He gathered loyal troops, including his hardened bodyguards and foreign mercenaries, and prepared a plan to trap the rioters. The decisive confrontation came in the Hippodrome itself, where the mob had gathered in the thousands, claiming Hypatius, a nephew of the former Emperor Anastasius, as their new ruler. It was there that Belisarius and Mundus struck. They sealed the exits, then stormed the arena with swords drawn. What followed was a massacre. Thousands of rioters were cut down. The Hippodrome transformed into a killing field. Chroniclers estimate that as many as 30,000 people were slaughtered in a single day, a staggering toll, but one that crushed the revolt beyond recovery. In a single stroke of violence, Belisarius saved Justinian's throne and the empire itself. The general who had triumphed at Dara had now proven that he could win battles not only against Persia, but against chaos within the empire's own heart. Justinian, Theodora, and the fragile throne, the Nika Revolt, was not only a test of military strength, but also of political willpower. Justinian, shaken by the scale of destruction, had seriously considered abandoning the city and fleeing into exile. What changed his mind was not his generals, but his wife, Theodora. In one of history's most famous speeches, she declared that she would rather die as an empress than live in flight. Reminding Justinian that the purple makes a fine burial shroud, her defiance stiffened his resolve. And it was this decision to stand firm that allowed Belisarius to act. Theodora's role in the revolt highlighted the fragility of Justinian's throne. Without her resolve, Constantinople might have been lost, and with it, the empire's dreams of reconquest. Yet the revolt also revealed just how much Justinian depended on men like Belisarius. The emperor could order, but it was Belisarius who executed, and it was his sword that determined whether the empire stood or fell. When the smoke cleared, Justinian faced the daunting task of rebuilding. Entire quarters of Constantinople lay in ruins, including Hagia Sophia. Yet from destruction came opportunity. Justinian would soon order the construction of a new Hagia Sophia, greater than any church in Christendom, a monument meant to erase the shame of the revolt and proclaim the glory of his reign. But while the city rose again, the scars of betrayal and bloodshed remained just beneath the surface. The political role of a general in Byzantium. The Nika revolt underscored a political truth of Byzantium. Generals were more than soldiers. They were power brokers, kingmakers, and sometimes potential rivals to the throne. Belisarius' suppression of the revolt elevated his stature enormously. He had become not merely a field commander, but the man who had preserved the empire's capital and throne. This newfound prestige was both a blessing and a danger. In a court as paranoid as Justinian's, success often bred suspicion. A general, too beloved by the army or the people, could be seen as a threat. Already whispers circulated. Was Belisarius too powerful? Could he, if he chose, seize the throne himself? The memory of Roman generals turned emperors, from Julius Caesar to Constantine, lingered like a shadow over every victorious commander. Belisarius, however, remained loyal. He presented himself as the obedient servant of Justinian, never overstepping, never boasting. Yet his actions in Constantinople had set a precedent. He was more than just the empire's sword. He was its shield, its protector in times of both foreign invasion and internal rebellion. This dual role would follow him throughout his career, shaping not only his victories, but also the jealousies and suspicions that later poisoned his relationship with Justinian. After the smoke, Belisarius' rising reputation. When the revolt was finally crushed, the city was a graveyard of ashes and corpses. But from that devastation, Belisarius emerged as a figure of immense prestige. He had stood firm when others faltered, struck decisively when hesitation might have doomed the empire, proven that he could act with both discipline and ruthlessness. For the people of Constantinople, his name now carried weight, the general who had protected them, even if it was through terrible bloodshed. For Justinian, Belisarius was indispensable. Yet the emperor was also acutely aware of what his general had become. A man beloved by soldiers, respected by citizens, and feared by enemies. It was both an asset and a liability. Justinian needed Belisarius for the wars to come. But he also watched him with the wary eyes of a ruler who trusted no one completely. Still, in 532, Belisarius was at the height of his early career. He had faced Persia, subdued Constantinople itself, and demonstrated a brilliance that set him apart from his peers. The stage was now set for Justinian's most ambitious gamble, the reconquest of the western provinces lost to the barbarians. And once again, it would be Belisarius who carried the imperial dream on his shoulders, this time across the sea into Africa. Africa lost. The rise of the Vandal kingdom. By the early 6th century, the western provinces of the old Roman Empire were fragmented and unstable. Among the most significant powers was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The Vandals had seized Carthage in 439 and declared themselves rulers of a kingdom stretching across modern-day Tunisia and parts of Algeria. Their naval strength in the Mediterranean was formidable, allowing them to raid Sicily, Sardinia, and even the Italian coast with impunity. The loss of North Africa was a massive blow to the empire. Not only did it deprive Constantinople of crucial grain supplies, but it also undermined Justinian's vision of a restored Roman world. The Vandals had transformed from mere marauders to rulers capable of challenging imperial authority. Their king, Gelimer, was both cunning and ruthless, and his court combined Roman administrative traditions with Germanic martial culture. Justinian saw the Vandalic War as both a strategic necessity and a personal challenge. Recovering Africa meant more than wealth and territory. It was a symbolic reclamation of Rome's lost dignity. For Belisarius, Africa represented a proving ground where his reputation as a master strategist could grow from eastern campaigns to global renown. Intelligence reports from spies, defectors, and merchants provided glimpses of Vandal defenses. But much remained uncertain, and the gamble would be immense. Preparing the fleet, a gamble for empire. Belisarius' first task was to organize a fleet capable of crossing the Mediterranean with speed and strength. This was no small feat. Ships had to be gathered, crews trained, and supplies stockpiled for men, horses, and siege equipment. The fleet itself became a microcosm of the empire's resources, drawing sailors, soldiers, and even local mercenaries into a massive, coordinated operation. Logistics were crucial. Fresh water, grain, and fodder had to be loaded for a voyage of several weeks. Belisarius personally oversaw the organization, knowing that even minor errors could doom the campaign before it began. He trained his men for both naval maneuvers and amphibious landings, emphasizing discipline and coordination. It was a gamble. The empire had never sent such a force so far west in modern memory. Political stakes added another layer of tension. The Senate in Constantinople watched anxiously, while Gelamor reportedly mocked the empire's intentions. Any failure would embolden other barbarian kingdoms and tarnish Justinian's image irreparably. Belisarius' careful planning, combined with the confidence instilled in his troops, transformed what could have been a chaotic venture into a disciplined, decisive strike force poised to reclaim Africa. The landing in Africa, facing the unknown. In 533, Belisarius' fleet landed near Kaput Vada, a stretch of coast south of Carthage. The terrain was harsh, with sandy beaches, dunes, and swamps, creating natural obstacles for both infantry and cavalry. Gelamor had initially underestimated the invaders, leaving the Vandals dispersed across the interior. Belisarius seized this opportunity, swiftly establishing a secure beachhead and organizing his forces for the inland march. The campaign was not without peril. Heat, unfamiliar terrain, and the threat of Vandal ambushes tested the discipline of his soldiers. Belisarius moved cautiously, using reconnaissance and local intelligence to avoid traps. His leadership style combined calculated risk-taking with meticulous planning, demonstrating why he was emerging as a general of legendary prudence. Civilians in the area played a pivotal role. Some towns welcomed the Byzantines as liberators from Vandal rule, providing supplies and guidance. Others resisted, siding with Gelamor's forces, forcing Belisarius to balance brutality with diplomacy. This nuanced approach allowed him to advance while minimizing unnecessary casualties and preserving the loyalty of local populations, a hallmark of his strategic genius. The Battle of Ad Decimum, a near disaster. The first major clash came at AD Decimum, near the 10th milestone outside Carthage. Belisarius faced Gelamor's army, which outnumbered his own forces and used the terrain to create ambushes. The battle was a tense interplay of maneuver, timing, and misdirection. Belisarius split his forces, positioning troops strategically to lure the Vandals into traps. While maintaining a reserve for sudden intervention, the fight turned perilous when Gelamor's nephew Amidas unexpectedly struck Belisarius' flank. Byzantine forces momentarily faltered, and it seemed the campaign might collapse before it truly began. Belisarius, calm under pressure, personally rallied his troops, using both words and deeds to restore order. The tide turned when the central command exploited a gap in the Vandal line, isolating Amidas' detachment and forcing a retreat. The victory, though hard one, demonstrated Belisarius' mastery of battlefield psychology. He had faced a numerically superior enemy, navigated unfamiliar terrain, and turned near disaster into triumph. This battle set the tone for the campaign, signaling that while the Vandals were formidable, Belisarius' combination of strategy, discipline, and daring would dominate the war. Triumph at Trichomerum. The Vandals destroyed. After Ad Decimum, Gelamor regrouped his forces, determined to strike back. Belisarius pursued him across the plains, culminating in the decisive Battle of Trichomerum. The Vandals, though desperate, could not match the cohesion and tactics of the Byzantines. Belisarius employed combined arms with cavalry, infantry, and archers, exploiting every weakness in Gelamor's formation. The battle ended with the total collapse of Vandal resistance. Gelamor fled into the desert, abandoning Carthage and leaving his kingdom in Byzantine hands. Casualties were high, but the victory secured Africa for Justinian and marked one of the most brilliant early campaigns in Belisarius' career. The general's careful planning, bold execution, and understanding of both military and psychological warfare had delivered a stunning triumph. The fall of the Vandals was more than a military success. It sent a clear message across the Mediterranean. The empire, under Justinian, was back on the offensive, and Belisarius had proven he could command campaigns as far west as he had in the east. Africa was restored to Roman rule, setting the stage for the ambitious Gothic War in Italy. Restoring Africa to Rome. After the decisive victory at Tricamarum, Belisarius faced the monumental task of bringing North Africa fully under imperial control. The Vandals had ruled these lands for nearly a century, and centuries-old grievances disrupted trade. Lingering pockets of resistance threatened the stability of Justinian's restored province. Belisarius knew that military victory alone would not suffice. He needed both political acumen and administrative skill to cement Roman authority. The general worked quickly to rebuild local governance, appointing loyal administrators while respecting existing structures where possible. Cities like Carthage were rebuilt, fortifications repaired, and trade routes reopened to revive commerce. Belisarius emphasized the importance of winning the hearts of the people, understanding that a contented population would be less likely to rise in rebellion. Religious tensions were another challenge. The Vandals had been Arian Christians, while the Roman population adhered to Chalcedonian Christianity. Belisarius carefully navigated these divisions, promoting tolerance while ensuring the primacy of the Orthodox faith. Churches were restored and clergy reinstated, giving the empire a moral as well as political foothold in the region. Belisarius also turned his attention to the military, establishing garrisons to deter any resurgence of Vandal forces or raids from neighboring tribes. Supply lines were secured, and veterans from his campaigns were stationed strategically to maintain order. This dual focus on civil and military stability ensured that North Africa became a dependable part of Justinian's empire, at least for the time being. By the time Belisarius prepared to leave Africa, the province was transformed. From a land fractured by conquest and unrest, it emerged as a model of imperial restoration, showcasing the efficiency and strategic brilliance of its general. Africa's recovery strengthened Justinian's position in the Mediterranean and highlighted Belisarius' unique ability to combine tactical genius with pragmatic governance. The campaign cemented his reputation not just as a conqueror, but as a restorer of Roman civilization in distant lands. Italy before the war, a divided land. Italy in the early 6th century was a fractured landscape. Torn by decades of Lombard migrations, Ostrogothic rule, and remnants of Roman authority, cities like Rome and Ravenna bore scars of previous conflicts, their fortifications still standing, but their civic structures weakened. Rural areas were lawless, and local lords often acted independently, complicating the ambitions of any reconquering force. Belisarius, surveying this mosaic, understood that military conquest would require careful political maneuvering as much as battlefield prowess. The Italian peninsula was also culturally divided. Roman traditions persisted in urban centers, while Gothic rulers imposed their customs, laws, and Arian Christian beliefs in the countryside. Aligning local populations to support Byzantine aims meant navigating religious and ethnic tensions with tact, ensuring that the army could advance without provoking widespread rebellion. Strategically, Italy presented both opportunity and challenge. The mountains and rivers provided natural defensive lines for Gothic forces, but also offered staging grounds for the disciplined Byzantine army. Control of key ports, especially in Sicily and the south, was crucial to maintain supply lines across the Mediterranean. Belisarius planned meticulously, knowing that neglecting logistics could doom even the most brilliant campaigns. The economic situation added another layer of difficulty. Cities had suffered depopulation and famine during prior wars, reducing the pool of resources and manpower. Belisarius relied on local allies and carefully coordinated his provisions to sustain his army while avoiding alienating the populace. The delicate balance of force and diplomacy would define the early stages of the Gothic War. By the time Belisarius crossed the Adriatic, Italy was a land ready for upheaval, but resistant to occupation. Understanding both its strengths and weaknesses, he prepared to exploit Gothic divisions, local dissatisfaction, and his own military genius to restore Roman influence to the peninsula. The stage was set for a war that would test his skill, patience, and adaptability like never before. Crossing into Sicily, the first step, Sicily represented the gateway to the Italian campaign, a vital link for Byzantine forces from North Africa. Belisarius' crossing was carefully timed, taking advantage of favorable winds and the loyalty of local populations weary of Gothic rule. The operation required coordination of ships, soldiers, and supplies across the narrow strait. a logistical feat that tested the general's planning as much as his courage. Upon landing, Belisarius faced immediate challenges. Gothic garrisons on the island attempted harassment and guerrilla skirmishes, testing his army's discipline. The general responded with a combination of swift strikes and careful fortifications, ensuring that supply lines remained secure while projecting an image of unstoppable momentum. His calm under pressure reassured his men and won over local communities, many of whom supplied intelligence and provisions. Sicily also offered Belisarius the chance to showcase his adaptability. Unlike the wide-open plains of Africa, the island's rugged terrain required innovative approaches to siegecraft, movement, and supply management. He relied on cavalry patrols to control mountain passes, engineers to reinforce fortifications, and scouts to anticipate Gothic maneuvers. The campaign on Sicily also underscored Belisarius's political acumen. He encouraged local leaders to retain positions of authority under Byzantine oversight, reducing resistance while bolstering loyalty. These measures smoothed the transition from conquest to administration, establishing a model for future operations in Italy. By the time Sicily was fully secured, Belisarius had achieved more than a mere landing. He had established a secure foothold, tested his army's coordination, and signaled to both Goths and locals that Byzantine power had returned. Sicily became a launch pad for the next phase of the campaign, mainland Italy, where the stakes would grow exponentially. The siege of Naples and the fall of the city. Naples was one of the first major cities to face Belisarius's direct assault, and the siege became a critical test of his strategic and diplomatic skills. Gothic defenders were well prepared, confident in their fortifications and the loyalty of the city's populace. Belisarius had to balance aggression with patience, employing both direct assaults and psychological tactics to wear down resistance. He orchestrated a careful blockade, cutting off supplies while offering terms of surrender that emphasized clemency for civilians. The siege also showcased his engineering expertise. With siege towers, ladders, and coordinated attacks designed to exploit weaknesses without unnecessary casualties. This careful approach reflected his understanding that winning hearts was as important as winning battles. Inside the city, factions began to emerge, some advocating resistance, others favoring surrender. Belisarius skillfully communicated with influential leaders, promising protection and rewards for cooperation. This combination of pressure and diplomacy gradually eroded Gothic morale, demonstrating that the general's reputation as both strategist and negotiator preceded him. After weeks of maneuvering, Naples finally capitulated. The city's fall provided a critical morale boost to Byzantine forces and sent a clear message to other Italian cities. Resistance was possible, but victory came to those who respected both the sword and shrewd diplomacy. Belisarius treated the city's populace with fairness, further cementing loyalty and stability. With Naples secured, Belisarius now had a key southern base for operations, enabling him to press northward into the Italian heartland. The siege illustrated the duality of his genius, the ability to combine military innovation with political finesse, turning every conquest into a foundation for lasting control. The entry into Rome, a symbolic victory. Rome, though no longer the capital of a vast empire, remained the symbolic heart of the Roman world. Its capture by Belisarius was as much about legitimacy and morale as about strategy. Byzantine forces approached cautiously, mindful of the city's historical significance and the potential for urban resistance. Belisarius' entry was carefully orchestrated to demonstrate both strength and respect. Troops maintained discipline, avoiding unnecessary destruction, while local leaders were reassured that Byzantine rule would honor Roman traditions. The spectacle of the general entering the city with banners and carefully chosen escorts reinforced the notion that the Roman Empire, under Justinian, was reclaiming its heritage. Strategically, controlling Rome allowed Belisarius to dominate central Italy, providing a base for further operations and a secure supply line from Sicily. The city also served as a powerful propaganda tool, showcasing the return of imperial authority to the Italian peninsula. The psychological impact on both Goths and Italians was profound. For many Italians, the presence of Belisarius represented hope for stability. For Gothic forces, it was a warning that their dominance was waning. Belisarius used this moment to negotiate with local factions, consolidating loyalty and minimizing the need for protracted urban warfare. Rome's capture demonstrated the general's ability to combine military action with careful symbolism, understanding that war was fought not just on the battlefield but in the minds of those he sought to govern. It set the stage for the upcoming sieges and campaigns that would define the Gothic War for years to come. It's the Great Siege of Rome, a city under fire. The Gothic response to Belisarius's presence in Rome was swift and brutal. Totalist forces encircled the city, laying siege with determination and attempting to reclaim one of Italy's most prized strongholds. Belisarius faced immense pressure, defending a city of immense symbolic and strategic value against a relentless adversary. He relied on the city's fortifications, innovative defensive tactics, and the discipline of his troops to withstand repeated assaults. Meanwhile, he coordinated sorties to disrupt Gothic siege works, demonstrating that even in defense, offensive initiative was crucial. Belisarius's presence on the walls inspired his soldiers, reinforcing their courage amidst the chaos of battle. Supplies were a constant concern, and Belisarius carefully managed food, water, and medical resources. Civilians were integrated into defensive efforts, with non-combatants supporting logistics, surveillance, and fortification repairs. This holistic approach strengthened both morale and practical resilience. Belisarius also employed psychological warfare, using visible displays of strength and strategic feints to sow confusion among Gothic ranks. News of his earlier victories and reputation as an undefeatable commander reached the enemy, further destabilizing Totila's efforts. Ultimately, the siege showcased the general's tactical genius in urban warfare. Despite the city being under constant threat, Belisarius' leadership ensured Rome remained in Byzantine hands, a testament to his enduring strategic brilliance and his ability to safeguard the heart of the empire. Endless defense. Belisarius holds the line. The months following the siege demanded relentless vigilance. Gothic forces continued to harry Roman positions, launching guerrilla attacks and probing Byzantine defenses. Belisarius understood that maintaining control required both endurance and adaptability. Constantly adjusting troop deployments to counter threats, he rotated forces, reinforced weak points, and maintained open communication lines with surrounding garrisons. His focus on logistics and supply ensured that his army could remain combat-ready over extended periods, turning prolonged defense into an offensive advantage. Morale was maintained through small victories, public rewards, and clear leadership. Soldiers and citizens alike recognized the strategic patience of Belisarius, trusting that resilience would eventually lead to the collapse of Gothic resistance. Belisarius also anticipated political maneuvers by Gothic commanders, using intelligence, scouts, and spies to preempt attacks. His awareness of both battlefield and political dynamics exemplified the dual role of a general in Byzantine warfare. By holding the line tirelessly, Belisarius preserved Byzantine dominance in central Italy. His actions not only protected the city, but also demonstrated that disciplined strategy and foresight could counter even the most determined opponents, reinforcing his legendary status as the empire's preeminent general. Guerrilla war in Italy, the struggle beyond cities. After the initial sieges and victories, Belisarius faced a more elusive challenge: Gothic forces retreating into the countryside to wage guerrilla warfare. Unlike set-piece battles, these engagements were unpredictable, with ambushes along mountain passes and sudden raids on supply lines. Belisarius responded with a combination of reconnaissance, rapid troop movements, and fortified outposts, ensuring his army could react quickly while minimizing losses. The terrain itself favored the defenders, with dense forests and rugged hills concealing small Gothic detachments. Byzantine soldiers adapted, forming scouting parties and employing light cavalry to patrol vulnerable regions. Belisarius also encouraged local populations to provide intelligence, turning the eyes and ears of civilians into an extension of his military network. One notable tactic was the use of feints and small-scale counterattacks, luring Gothic forces out of hiding into carefully prepared positions. This allowed Belisarius to strike decisively without overextending his main army, combining patience with tactical audacity. It was a war of endurance, where morale and discipline often mattered more than numbers. Economic warfare played a role as well. Belisarius disrupted Gothic supply chains, seizing provisions and denying resources to enemy forces. By controlling trade routes and key granaries, he gradually starved the enemy of sustenance while keeping his own army well-fed. The prolonged struggle highlighted the limits of military glory. Even with brilliant strategy, the countryside could not be conquered by sheer force alone. Belisarius' genius lay in integrating military skill with diplomacy, intelligence, and psychological insight, gradually eroding Gothic resistance without unnecessary destruction. The fall of Ravenna, the Emperor of the West captured. Ravenna, the Gothic capital, stood as the ultimate prize in the Italian campaign. Its marshy surroundings, formidable walls, and strategic canals made it a natural fortress. Belisarius approached with caution, understanding that a reckless assault could result in catastrophic losses. Instead, he combined negotiation with subtle threats, sowing doubt among Gothic commanders. The Byzantine army's approach was methodical. Supply lines were secured, and contingencies prepared for every possible Gothic counterattack. Belisarius also leveraged political divisions within the city. Many citizens resented Gothic rule and were willing to support Byzantine forces if their safety and property were guaranteed. Eventually, Ravenna surrendered, and with it, the Gothic king was captured. This was a landmark victory, symbolizing the collapse of organized Gothic resistance in Italy. Belisarius treated the city with measured generosity, avoiding wholesale looting and preserving civic infrastructure, earning the loyalty of both citizens and former enemies. The fall of Ravenna also sent ripples across Europe. Neighboring regions recognized the resurgence of Byzantine power, while within Italy, local lords reconsidered their allegiances. Belisarius' ability to combine military might with diplomacy turned what could have been a destructive conquest into a stabilizing operation. This chapter of the campaign exemplified the duality of Belisarius' genius, a general capable of battlefield brilliance, while simultaneously mastering the art of political control. Ravenna became a model for future occupations, demonstrating that victory was most durable when paired with judicious governance. Belisarius offered the Western throne. In the wake of Ravenna's fall, whispers began circulating. Belisarius, victorious, capable, and charismatic, could claim the Western throne. Many in Italy, including nobles and some Byzantine officers, viewed him as the rightful ruler to restore unity and stability. Yet Belisarius remained loyal to Justinian, understanding the delicate politics of power. The offer itself highlighted both his renown and the tension it caused at the Byzantine court. Accepting could have meant instant dominion over Italy, but also open rebellion against the emperor. Belisarius, ever the disciplined soldier, refused the temptation, emphasizing duty over personal ambition. His loyalty became legendary, reinforcing his reputation as a servant of the empire rather than a self-interested opportunist. This episode also illustrates the precarious balance between military success and political vulnerability. Generals who achieved extraordinary victories often faced suspicion at court, where envy and fear of insubordination were rampant. Belisarius' refusal of the throne diffused potential crises while cementing his moral authority. Moreover, the decision reinforced his strategic patience. By remaining under Justinian's command, he retained resources, legitimacy, and the opportunity for further campaigns. Personal ambition was subordinated to the broader objectives of restoring the Roman world. The story of the Western throne offer became part of his enduring legend. A general so competent and respected that he could have seized power but chose loyalty over ambition, embodying the ideal of Roman virtue in a time of imperial transition. The recall to Constantinople, triumph or jealousy? Despite victories in Italy, Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople, a move that some historians interpret as jealousy rather than necessity. Justinian may have feared that continued fame in the West would overshadow his own authority. Demonstrating the perilous intersection of military prowess and court politics, Belisarius returned with triumphs, treasures, and the admiration of his men, yet he entered a court rife with suspicion. Envy and intrigue greeted him. Some nobles feared his influence, while Justinian, wary of overmighty generals, watched carefully. Belisarius navigated this environment with characteristic composure, leveraging reputation and diplomacy to maintain favor. The recall also signaled the limits of military glory in a centralized autocracy. No matter the victories, generals were ultimately servants of the emperor, their fates entwined with the caprices of court politics. Belisarius' return was a reminder that battlefield genius alone could not secure independence or personal security. Yet he remained a figure of immense prestige. Public celebrations and accounts of Italian victories reinforced his image as Byzantium's foremost general. Even within the political machinations, his legacy as a hero of the empire endured. This chapter underscores a recurring theme in Belisarius' life: the tension between extraordinary competence and the vulnerabilities imposed by imperial politics. Triumph in the field did not always translate to security at court, a lesson that shaped his subsequent decisions and campaigns. Justinian's suspicion, the price of success. Belisarius' fame, however well-earned, inevitably provoked suspicion. Success bred fear in an emperor whose authority depended on centralized power. Justinian, mindful of potential usurpation, monitored Belisarius closely, limiting his autonomy despite battlefield achievements. Courtiers and rivals amplified this fear, suggesting that the general's loyalty might falter. Belisarius, aware of the delicate balance, continued to act with restraint and diplomacy. He avoided ostentation, deferred honors to the emperor, and emphasized that all victories were in Justinian's name. The tension between recognition and restriction reflects the Byzantine reality. Military success was both a tool and a threat. Belisarius' experience serves as a study in navigating fame, loyalty, and imperial politics, showing that brilliance could be both celebrated and feared. This chapter also hints at the human side of Belisarius. Despite suspicion, he remained committed to the empire's goals, demonstrating moral courage as much as military skill. The price of success was constant vigilance, strategic patience, and personal humility. Ultimately, Justinian's suspicion shaped Belisarius's later career, influencing decisions, recalls, and deployments. It was a reminder that in Byzantium, the battlefield was inseparable from the palace, and a general's greatest challenge was often the emperor himself. The Plague of Justinian, a world in crisis. The outbreak of the Plague of Justinian in 541 CE transformed the political and military landscape of the empire. Unlike a battlefield enemy, this invisible killer spread rapidly, killing thousands daily in Constantinople and across Italy, the Balkans, and the Near East. Belisarius' campaigns were suddenly overshadowed by a crisis that no general could simply outmaneuver. For soldiers, the plague was both demoralizing and deadly. Troop numbers dwindled, supply lines became chaotic, and entire garrisons faced the specter of illness. Belisarius adapted by implementing quarantine measures in camps, reorganizing units to compensate for losses, and prioritizing the protection of vital personnel. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Fields went untended, cities faced shortages, and trade across the Mediterranean faltered. Belisarius, aware that sustaining campaigns depended on logistics, had to coordinate with Justinian's administrators to secure food and provisions for surviving armies. Psychologically, the plague created a sense of fatalism among both soldiers and civilians. Religious interpretations flourished, with many seeing the epidemic as divine punishment. Belisarius navigated these perceptions carefully, reinforcing morale through example, discipline, and visible acts of leadership amidst widespread fear. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Belisarius continued to lead with determination. His campaigns slowed, but did not halt, demonstrating his resilience in an environment where ordinary generals might have surrendered to panic. The plague revealed the limits of human control, but also highlighted Belisarius' adaptability under pressure. This period marked a turning point, emphasizing that even the greatest military minds were vulnerable to the uncontrollable forces of nature. And yet the empire relied on their guidance to survive the crisis. The Balkans and the Slavs. New threats on the Danube. While the empire reeled from the plague, the Danube frontier became increasingly unstable. Slavic tribes and other groups exploited weakened Byzantine defenses, raiding settlements and threatening crucial trade routes. Belisarius, though primarily engaged in Italy, was consulted on strategic responses, underscoring his status as a trusted imperial advisor. These raids were different from conventional warfare. The attackers were mobile, elusive, and unpredictable, often vanishing into dense forests after striking villages. Belisarius emphasized fortified positions along the Danube and coordinated rapid response detachments, capable of intercepting raiding parties before they reached major towns. Diplomacy played a critical role. Treaties, tribute, and strategic settlements were sometimes preferable to prolonged conflict. Allowing the empire to stabilize regions without overextending military resources, Belisarius' council helped balance force with negotiation, reflecting his long-term vision of frontier security. Logistics again proved pivotal. Maintaining garrisons, securing supplies, and ensuring communication along the frontier were enormous challenges, especially with the plague still affecting manpower. Belisarius' experience in Italy informed his recommendations. Highlighting the importance of combining local intelligence with disciplined forces, the Danube campaigns illustrate the empire's multi-front vulnerability. Even a general of Belisarius' caliber could not be everywhere at once. But his strategic insights enabled the emperor to allocate forces effectively, minimizing the chaos from repeated incursions. Through these northern conflicts, Belisarius demonstrated his enduring relevance, proving that his genius was not confined to grand battles, but extended to the complexities of empire-wide defense. Turn to Italy. Belisarius fights again. By the late 540s, Gothic resistance in Italy had regained momentum. Belisarius was dispatched once more to restore Byzantine control, facing a landscape scarred by previous battles, famine, and disease. His return was both a morale boost for loyal troops and a signal to enemies that the empire would not relinquish its Italian ambitions. The Gothic forces, now led by Totila, were more coordinated and determined.
Belisarius
Relied on intelligence, reconnaissance, and flexible formations, avoiding static confrontations when possible. Skirmishes, ambushes, and sieges became the primary modes of engagement, testing his adaptability and endurance. Civilians played a crucial role once again. Belisarius cultivated local alliances, emphasizing fair treatment to secure loyalty and suppress resistance. He understood that military success depended on political as well as tactical acumen, blending force with diplomacy to stabilize the regions he sought to reclaim. The Italian campaign also demonstrated the limits of manpower. Troops were fatigued from years of continuous warfare, supply lines were stretched thin, and disease lingered in many regions. Belisarius' logistical skill was as vital as battlefield prowess, ensuring that his army could remain operational despite these obstacles. Every victory was hard-won, reflecting a combination of patience, foresight, and resilience. Belisarius' return solidified his reputation as a general who could revive faltering campaigns and maintain the empire's presence in contested territories. His campaigns in Italy during this period exemplified the blend of courage, strategy, and endurance that defined his career, reinforcing why he was considered the empire's most capable military leader. The war grows endless, exhaustion, and stalemate by the mid-540s. The Italian campaign reached a protracted stalemate. Gothic forces, familiar with the terrain, employed defensive tactics and guerrilla warfare, while Byzantine forces struggled with extended supply lines and dwindling manpower. Even Belisarius, with his tactical genius, faced the relentless grind of attrition. Sieges dragged on, cities changed hands multiple times, and both sides suffered from disease and fatigue. Belisarius relied heavily on morale, discipline, and rotational deployments to keep troops effective, balancing offensive actions with strategic patience. Political pressures compounded the difficulty. Justinian demanded results, while rival generals and court factions scrutinized every decision. Belisarius had to navigate not only the battlefield but also the court's expectations, balancing military prudence with the demand for visible triumphs. Local populations, weary from war, often vacillated between cooperation and resistance. Belisarius employed policies of protection, fair taxation, and judicious use of force, maintaining order while minimizing alienation, a delicate equilibrium essential for long-term control. This stalemate underscored a recurring theme in Belisarius's career. Even the greatest victories required endurance and adaptability. The ability to maintain cohesion, discipline, and strategic focus over years of attrition was as critical as winning individual battles. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the war's outcome depended as much on patience and logistics as on battlefield heroics. Highlighting Belisarius' exceptional skill in sustaining long-term campaigns under grueling conditions. Rival generals in court intrigue, Belisarius' successes inevitably attracted envy. Rival generals, threatened by his fame, plotted subtly at court, seeking to undermine him and influenced Justinian's perception. Political intrigue became a constant backdrop to his military campaigns, demanding as much vigilance as any enemy army. Court factions attempted to manipulate information, exaggerate failures, or question his loyalty. Belisarius, however, navigated these intrigues with discretion, never openly confronting rivals while maintaining his reputation for loyalty and competence. His humility and measured demeanor became as essential as battlefield skill in preserving his position. The interplay of military achievement and political vulnerability illustrates the precarious position of great generals in Byzantium. Success on the field often invited scrutiny and jealousy at court, forcing leaders to master diplomacy alongside strategy. Belisarius' approach combined prudence with subtle assertion. By documenting achievements, cultivating allies, demonstrating unwavering service to Justinian, he neutralized threats without public confrontation, exemplifying strategic patience in both military and political arenas. This chapter reveals the dual challenges of leadership. One could conquer enemies abroad, yet the most insidious threats often emerged from within the palace. Belisarius' ability to survive and thrive in this environment underscores his multifaceted genius. The fall of Totila and the Gothic resistance. Totila's resurgence had prolonged the war, but Belisarius and Byzantine forces, employing siegecraft, strategic alliances, and relentless pressure, ultimately overcame Gothic resistance. Totila himself fell in battle, symbolizing the collapse of organized opposition in Italy. The final campaigns were a masterclass in coordination, blending field maneuvers with sieges, securing supply lines, and leveraging intelligence from local populations. Belisarius understood that Gothic morale was fragile. Decisive victories at critical moments could shatter resistance without prolonged attrition. Once Totila was defeated, remaining Gothic forces either surrendered or fled, leaving the Byzantines to consolidate control. Belisarius oversaw stabilization efforts, balancing security with reconciliation to prevent future uprisings. The fall of Totila marked the effective end of Gothic power in Italy, restoring nominal Byzantine authority. However, the campaign had taken its toll on troops and generals alike, leaving scars on the landscape, cities, and communities involved. Belisarius' management of the final phase cemented his legacy as a general capable of not only tactical brilliance, but strategic patience, political savvy, and humane governance, highlighting why he remained the most celebrated military figure of Justinian's reign. Back to the east, the war renewed. After years of grueling campaigns in the west, Belisarius was once again summoned to confront the empire's oldest and most formidable rival, Persia. Khosrau, a cunning and ambitious ruler, saw the Byzantine Empire weakened by the plague and overstretched by its wars in Italy and Africa. He launched renewed offensives along the eastern frontier, threatening key cities and trade routes that formed the backbone of imperial security. Belisarius, though physically older and burdened by decades of campaigning, retained his strategic brilliance. Upon his arrival in the east, he immediately assessed the situation. Garrisons were undermanned, local morale was low, and logistical chains were fragile. Rather than rushing into battle, he prioritized fortification repairs, troop reorganization, and restoring discipline among soldiers who had grown complacent during relative peace. The Persian strategy emphasized swift raids, sieges, psychological warfare, burning fields, seizing hostages, and spreading rumors of Byzantine weakness. Belisarius countered with calculated defenses, ambushes and narrow passes, and diplomatic gestures to local Arab allies, ensuring the frontier did not fracture under pressure. The renewed eastern campaign was less about conquest and more about maintaining imperial integrity. Belisarius understood that Justinian's ambitions in the west depended on stability in the east. His role was to act as both shield and deterrent, proving that even in his later years, his presence alone could stabilize a volatile front. The war's renewal in the east symbolized a full-circle moment in Belisarius's career. He returned to the same Persian front where he had first risen to fame decades earlier, now as a seasoned, almost legendary commander. Confronting familiar foes with the weight of history on his shoulders, Belisarius versus Khosrau, the last duel of giants. The confrontation between Belisarius and Khosrau I was more than a military clash. It was a duel between two brilliant strategists who defined their era. Khosrau, aware of Belisarius's reputation, avoided direct battles where Byzantine discipline and tactics could prevail. Instead, he employed deception, feigned retreats, and targeted weak points in the Byzantine defenses, hoping to draw the general into traps. Belisarius anticipated these maneuvers with almost uncanny foresight. Using mobile cavalry detachments, he shadowed Persian movements, striking their foraging parties, disrupting communications, ensuring that no single raid escalated into a strategic breakthrough. His defensive hybrid tactics frustrated Khosrow, who sought quick victories but found himself entangled in a drawn-out chess match. The Persians attempted to besiege key fortresses, expecting Byzantine forces to crumble under pressure. Belisarius turned the tables by orchestrating relief operations with precise timing, arriving at critical moments to lift sieges and rout isolated Persian forces. His mastery of timing and terrain transformed potentially catastrophic situations into moral-boosting victories. Khosrow adapted by shifting to psychological warfare, spreading false rumors of Belisarius' dismissal, forging letters to sow distrust among local commanders, and attempting to bribe Arab allies. Belisarius responded not with counter-propaganda but through visible leadership, riding among troops, personally inspecting defenses, and demonstrating unwavering command presence. This duel of giants didn't culminate in one decisive battle, but in a series of tactical engagements and strategic feints, where Belisarius' experience blunted Khosrow's aggression. Both men emerged with their reputations intact, but the Byzantines retained the strategic advantage, largely thanks to Belisarius' steady hand. The campaign of 541, a shadow of former glory. The campaign of 541 CE marked one of the most challenging episodes of Belisarius' career. The empire, ravaged by plague and stretched thin, could no longer field the massive, disciplined armies of his earlier triumphs. Belisarius led forces that were smaller, less cohesive, and often plagued by supply shortages. His brilliance was now tested under conditions far from ideal. Khosrow took advantage of this weakness, striking deep into Byzantine territory and laying siege to key fortresses. Belisarius, instead of engaging in pitched battles, focused on flexible maneuvers, harassing Persian columns, forcing them to overextend, and striking isolated detachments. His goal was to slow the enemy's advance, not to annihilate them outright. Morale became a pressing issue. Many soldiers had lost faith after years of war and disease. Belisarius, aware of this psychological strain, made a point of being visible and active, inspecting fortifications personally, rewarding valor, and ensuring clear communication throughout the ranks. His leadership style emphasized presence over distant command, reinvigorating troops despite grim circumstances. The campaign also exposed the political vulnerabilities of Belisarius. Some at court questioned his effectiveness, interpreting the lack of grand victories as evidence of decline. Yet those on the front understood the truth. Belisarius was holding the line with limited means, preventing disasters through ingenuity rather than overwhelming force. This phase revealed the evolution of the general from a youthful conqueror winning decisive victories to a seasoned strategist mastering defensive warfare under constrained resources. It was a quieter form of greatness, but no less impressive. Negotiations and uneasy peace after years of attritional conflict. Neither the Byzantines nor the Persians could sustain a full-scale war indefinitely. Economic strain, plague, and political pressures pushed both empires toward negotiation. Belisarius, while primarily a soldier, played a crucial role in facilitating diplomatic channels, leveraging his reputation to assure both sides that peace could be achieved without dishonor. Negotiations were complex. Khosrow demanded heavy tribute and territorial concessions, while Justinian sought a face-saving settlement that preserved strategic positions. Belisarius advised moderation, recognizing that the empire's overstretched condition made prolonged war unsustainable. His pragmatic counsel helped temper Justinian's ambitions with military realities. The peace that emerged was uneasy, more a truce than a permanent settlement. Border skirmishes continued, but large-scale campaigns subsided. This temporary respite allowed the Byzantine state to redirect attention to internal rebuilding in other theaters, including the Balkans and Italy. Belisarius' involvement in negotiations underscores his multifaceted role. He was not merely a battlefield commander, but also a trusted advisor, diplomat, and strategic thinker. His presence lent credibility to Byzantine commitments and ensured that military realities shaped diplomatic outcomes. While this peace was not glorious, it was strategically vital. It bought time for the empire to recover, demonstrating Belisarius' understanding that sometimes restraint achieves what swords cannot. Retirement and reflection. The old general, after decades of war, glory, suspicion, and political tension, Belisarius gradually withdrew from the forefront of imperial campaigns. He had fought in Persia, Africa, Italy, and the Balkans. He had commanded fleets and cavalry, besieged cities, and crushed rebellions in the capital itself. But by the 540s and 550s, age began to weigh upon him. Once the young protege of Justinian, Belisarius now occupied a quieter position in Constantinople, an aging general in a court increasingly dominated by bureaucrats, eunuchs, and younger officers eager to make their own names. Yet his presence still commanded respect. His victories were carved into the memory of the empire. In his retirement, Belisarius wasn't cast out entirely. Justinian continued to employ him occasionally in military and diplomatic matters, though with caution. There was always a lingering suspicion in the imperial court. A man who had been offered the Western imperial crown in Ravenna, even if he refused it, was a man who could inspire armies. Thus, Belisarius walked a delicate line, respected but watched. His estates around the capital became places of quiet reflection rather than military planning. Unlike many Roman generals of the past, Belisarius didn't use his fortune to raise a private army or build a faction against the emperor. His loyalty had been tested time and again during the Nika Revolt, during the Vandalic War, during his recall from Italy, and he had remained steadfast. That loyalty, however, didn't necessarily translate into affection from the court. Many saw him as a relic of an earlier, more heroic age, valuable but no longer central. Belisarius' retirement also unfolded during a time of change for the empire. The plague of Justinian had devastated populations, imperial finances were strained, and wars dragged on without the same decisive victories that had marked his early career. Watching the slow erosion of the conquests he had achieved must have been painful. North Africa was increasingly unstable, Italy remained a battlefield, and even the Eastern Front simmered with Persian threats. The dream of Justinian's restored empire was fading before his eyes. Perhaps the most striking aspect of his later years was his relative silence. There are no surviving manifestos, no bitter letters, no attempts to write memoirs. Belisarius, unlike Caesar or even some later generals, seemed content to retreat with dignity. History would later fill this silence with myths, but the reality is that he simply faded into the background, a lion resting after a lifetime of battle, the scandal, accused of corruption. But retirement did not mean peace. Late in his life, Belisarius found himself embroiled in a scandal that shocked Constantinople. The charge was corruption specifically, accusations that members of his household had accepted bribes or engaged in illicit dealings while he turned a blind eye. Whether this was true, partially true, or entirely fabricated by jealous courtiers is still debated.
What is certain is that the accusations struck at the heart of his reputation.
For decades, Belisarius had been the embodiment of imperial virtue and military honor. Now that image was under attack. It's worth noting that the Byzantine court was notorious for intrigue. Powerful generals were often undermined not on the battlefield but in the halls of the palace. Accusing someone of corruption was a common tactic. It allowed one to damage an opponent without accusing them of outright treason, which could backfire. Belisarius, with his immense prestige, was a prime target for rivals who saw an opportunity to finally bring him low. The emperor's reaction was cautious, but significant. Justinian, now an elderly ruler himself, ordered an investigation. This was no mere formality. If found guilty, Belisarius could face confiscation of property, public humiliation, or even imprisonment. The man who had once restored Africa and conquered Italy now stood at risk of losing everything he had built, not through war, but through politics. Contemporary accounts suggest that Belisarius maintained his composure throughout the proceedings. His enemies expected fiery resistance. Instead, they found a weary general who simply submitted to imperial authority, confident perhaps that his long service would speak for itself. Yet in the charged atmosphere of the palace, even a whisper could become a roar. The scandal marked a tragic turn. Whether guilty or not, Belisarius's name was now being dragged through the mud in the very city he had once saved during the Nika Revolt. His fall from grace wasn't dramatic in the sense of a rebellion or coup, but it was deeply symbolic. The empire he had defended now turned its gaze upon him. The trial of Belisarius. Legend or reality? The trial of Belisarius occupies a strange place between history and legend. Some Byzantine sources describe it as a formal legal proceeding, with accusations, witnesses, and a verdict. Others suggest it was more of an administrative inquiry, quietly resolved behind palace doors. Later, medieval and Renaissance writers, however, transformed this episode into something grander. A noble old general betrayed by his emperor, put on public trial like a criminal, became a moral tale about loyalty, ingratitude, and imperial decay. At the heart of the legend is the idea that Belisarius was wronged by Justinian, that after years of service, he was humiliated and cast aside. Whether that's entirely true is uncertain. What is clear is that the scandal shook Constantinople. The people who still revered Belisarius as a hero murmured uneasily. Could the savior of Rome and Africa really be a corrupt schemer? Or was this the work of jealous courtiers manipulating an aging emperor? The trial, such as it was, ended without a dramatic execution or exile. Belisarius was fined, his household reprimanded, and for a time he lived under a shadow. But Justinian did not destroy him, perhaps out of genuine respect, perhaps because doing so would have enraged the populace. This measured punishment added to the aura of ambiguity around the event. It was neither a clear vindication nor a devastating downfall. Over the centuries, Western writers would elevate this trial into a tragic climax. The Enlightenment, in particular, adored the image of Belisarius as the noble hero betrayed by tyranny, a theme that fit their critique of absolute monarchy. Paintings of a blind beggar, Belisarius, asking for alms on the streets of Constantinople, became iconic in Europe. Though historically inaccurate, these stories kept his memory alive. The trial shows how Belisarius, even in decline, became a mirror for larger cultural anxieties. For Byzantines, he represented a fading era of military greatness. For later Europeans, he symbolized virtue betrayed by power. History and myth intertwined irreversibly. The General in Chains, the famous myth. No story about Belisarius' end is more famous than the myth of his blinding and beggary. According to later legend, Justinian ordered Belisarius to be blinded, reduced him to poverty, forced him to beg for alms on the streets of Constantinople, crying out, "Give alms to Belisarius," as passers-by wept for the fallen hero. It is a deeply powerful image, the empire's greatest general, brought low not by enemies, but by his own emperor. This story has little basis in contemporary Byzantine sources. There is no solid evidence that Belisarius was ever blinded or reduced to poverty. It appears to have originated centuries later, perhaps in the 9th century, and gained popularity in the West during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. But despite its dubious authenticity, the myth stuck because it felt true in a symbolic sense. It captured the tension between glory and betrayal, between service and ingratitude. Artists, dramatists, and philosophers embraced this image. In 18th century France, the figure of blind Belisarius became a subject of plays, operas, and paintings. He was portrayed as a martyr to imperial cruelty, a moral exemplar. This romanticized version of his downfall far outlived the real events of his trial. In some ways, the legend of Belisarius became more influential than his actual deeds. The myth also reveals something profound about how societies remember their heroes. Facts fade, but narratives endure. A blind, begging Belisarius may not have walked the streets of Constantinople, but he walked the corridors of European imagination for centuries. Even Napoleon reportedly admired him as a figure of loyalty betrayed. It's a fitting irony. The man who rebuilt parts of the Roman world was remembered most vividly through a story that never happened. But perhaps this too is part of legacy. Legends fill the silence that history leaves behind. Restoration of honor. Belisarius rehabilitated despite the scandal and the myths. Belisarius' final years ended with a measure of dignity. Justinian eventually restored him to favor, allowing him to return to court and live out his days in relative peace. Some sources suggest he was even entrusted with minor commands in his old age, perhaps more as a symbolic gesture than as active leadership. The emperor and his general, both old men by now, seem to have reached a quiet reconciliation. The rehabilitation wasn't marked by grand ceremonies or public declarations. It was subtle. The charges against him faded, his properties were restored, and he resumed his place as a respected elder statesman. In this way, Belisarius avoided the tragic ends that befell many Roman generals before him. He was neither assassinated nor exiled. He simply faded from the center stage, his honor largely intact. By the time of his death, probably in the late 560s, Belisarius had outlived many of his rivals. The empire he had helped to expand was showing cracks, but his personal legend was secure. He had served faithfully under an emperor who both elevated and constrained him. He had won battles across 3 continents, crushed rebellions, and inspired fear in Rome's enemies. Few men in history had done so much, in so many theaters of war, with such consistent brilliance. Later historians would argue endlessly about his relationship with Justinian. Was he a loyal servant, or a suppressed potential usurper? A brilliant strategist overshadowed by imperial jealousy, or a hero who accepted his role within a complex system? Perhaps he was all of these things. But what matters most is that his name endured. Even the myths, though inaccurate, were a kind of tribute. In the end, Belisarius died not in chains or disgrace, but as a revered figure. His funeral, though not grandiose, was attended by those who remembered his victories. His story, however, was only beginning, because legends, once born, never truly die. Was Belisarius the last Roman? Belisarius is often called the last Roman, a title that captures both admiration and melancholy. Lived in a world where the old Roman Empire had fractured, its western half fallen to barbarian kingdoms, its eastern half transformed into the Byzantine state. Yet in his conduct, strategy, and sense of duty, Belisarius seemed to embody the classical Roman virtues more than anyone else of his age. He fought like a Roman general, commanded with Roman discipline, and sought to restore Roman lands. This title also reflects a historical turning point. After Belisarius, the empire's military would increasingly be led by generals from non-Roman backgrounds: Isaurians, Armenians, Slavs, and others. The old senatorial elite that had produced figures like Belisarius was fading. He stood at the crossroads between the Roman past and the medieval Byzantine future, a bridge between 2 worlds. Strategically, Belisarius represented the last great practitioner of the Roman art of combined arms and maneuver warfare. His campaigns against the Vandals, Goths, and Persians demonstrated flexibility, cunning, and discipline. Later, Byzantine warfare would rely more on fortified defenses, diplomacy, and mercenary contingents than on sweeping campaigns led by a single charismatic general. Culturally, his memory became a vessel for nostalgia. Later generations looked back at his victories as the last blaze of Roman glory before the long centuries of defensive warfare and gradual decline. For Western Europeans rediscovering Roman history centuries later, Belisarius appeared almost as a lost Caesar, brilliant, loyal, and tragically underappreciated. Whether or not he was truly the last Roman is debatable, but the fact that the question is asked at all speaks volumes. He was the last to fully feel Roman in an empire that was becoming something else. Justinian's empire. Glory and fragility. Belisarius, in memory, Belisarius. Story cannot be separated from Justinian's vision. Together, emperor and general created one of the last great expansions of Roman power. But their partnership also revealed the fragility beneath the glory. The reconquest strained imperial resources, depopulated regions were hard to hold, and enemies constantly probed the borders. Belisarius won battles, but Justinian's empire couldn't fully sustain the victories. In this sense, his legacy is both triumphant and bittersweet. In the centuries that followed, Belisarius' memory traveled far beyond Byzantium. Medieval chroniclers, Renaissance humanists, Enlightenment philosophers, modern historians all found something in him that spoke to their own times: loyalty, brilliance, tragedy, heroism. He became a canvas upon which different eras painted their values. His legend endured because his life contained every element of a timeless epic, a rise from obscurity. Brilliant victories, loyalty under suspicion, trials and scandals, myths of betrayal, and eventual rehabilitation. Whether in the streets of Constantinople, the deserts of Persia, the plains of Africa, or the ruins of Rome, Belisarius' shadow lingered. In the end, Belisarius was not merely a general. He was a symbol of Rome's last resurgence, of the tension between service and power, of the enduring allure of military genius. His name became a shorthand for both glory and ingratitude. And perhaps that is why centuries later we still tell his story. As the curtain falls on the life of Belisarius, we're left with a story that's as much about ambition and empire as it is about loyalty and legacy. His victories stretched across continents, his strategies reshaped wars, and his legend transcended centuries. Yet his fate also reminds us of the fragility of power, how even the greatest generals can be praised and doubted in the same breath. If you've stayed with me through this journey from the dusty plains of Dara to the marble halls of Constantinople, you now carry the tale of the man many call the last Roman. His name may have faded from everyday memory, but in the quiet moments of history his footsteps still echo. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about human stories, loyalty, betrayal, vision, and legacy. And Belisarius gave us all of that in one lifetime. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating figures, make sure to like this video. It helps more history lovers discover these forgotten tales. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next long journey into the strange and extraordinary past. And if you want to support more epic historical documentaries like this one, consider leaving a comment with your thoughts or even suggesting the next forgotten figure or bizarre historical era we should explore. This was the last great Roman general, Belisarius, and the wars of Justinian. Thank you for watching, and until next time, sleep well in the ruins of history.